Right. Let's jump right in. The Cold War. I mean, talk about a period that still has its fingers in everything today. You with me?
Definitely. It's like the echo of it just keeps bouncing around.
Exactly. And today we're looking at it through a fascinating lens. We're diving into 24 lectures on the international history of the Cold War.
Ah, by Shen Zhihua?
You know him.
Oh, yeah, he's a huge name in China when it comes to Cold War history, kind of pushing everyone to hit the reset button on how we view this whole era.
Love it. So tell us a little bit about the book itself.
Well, it was published in 2018. It's actually part of this whole series on international history.
Okay.
East China Normal University Press put it out.
So, we're dealing with some serious scholarship here.
Absolutely.
But don't worry, we're going to break it down, make it fun. And one of the first things that popped for me was how Shen kind of throws that whole Iron Curtain speech as the start of the Cold War out the window.
Yeah, that's a common misconception.
Right, we're so used to 1946, Churchill, boom, Cold War starts. But Shen says even back then, even the Soviets, they didn't necessarily see it that way.
What he does is he takes us back to like right after World War II. The anxieties, the goals, all of it, both the U.S. and the USSR coming out of this huge conflict.
Totally different worlds though, right?
Oh, yeah. Like the U.S., they wanted to rebuild a global order. Makes sense. And of course, there's that whole containment thing, right?
Got to stop the spread of communism. It was the fear.
Exactly. But then you've got the USSR just been absolutely devastated by the war. I mean, millions dead. Their focus was way more about security, just rebuilding their own strength.
Which is interesting because I don't know about you, but growing up, it was all Soviet expansionism. Like they just wanted to take over the world.
Right, like it was purely ideological.
Yeah, but Shen's saying it's not that simple.
He actually uses this concept from E.H. Carr, this British historian, called the 20 Years Crisis.
Okay, never heard of it.
It's basically this argument that the whole interwar period between World War I and World War II was just inherently unstable.
Ripe for conflict.
Exactly. So Shen's point is that there were these deeper things going on, forces that were going to lead to conflict no matter what, not just this simple communism versus capitalism thing.
Okay, so we've got a world primed for a showdown, but then you drop in the atomic bomb. I mean, game changer, right?
Totally. And not just from a military standpoint. Shen argues that, especially Western historians, they kind of miss how impactful the bomb was psychologically.
Oh, I bet.
It introduced this whole new level of fear, uncertainty on a scale never seen before. It changed how countries interacted. It changed everything.
It's like an unblinking eye just watching everyone.
Exactly. You couldn't escape it. And that atmosphere, that fear, I think you need that to understand guys like George Kennan.
Oh, yeah, Mr. Long Telegraph shaped how the whole U.S. viewed the USSR, didn't he?
You know, Shen gives him credit for insight, but he also says Kennan simplified things too much.
How so?
Well, Kennan was convinced that Soviet actions were purely ideological, like this monolithic force of communism always trying to expand.
Which, to be fair, they were promoting communism.
They were, but Shen argues that Kennan kind of misses the complex historical and geopolitical stuff going on too, all those other factors influencing Soviet actions.
So while Kennan's right to be wary of Soviet influence, maybe he missed some of their legitimate security concerns.
That's the point Shen's making. He thinks that by oversimplifying things, Kennan actually helped make tensions worse.
Huh, that's interesting. So it wasn't just one speech, one event. The Cold War, it was brewing for a while.
Yeah, it was this gradual buildup, this mistrust, misunderstandings, and just a whole lot of fear mixed in there.
Fear, yeah. And speaking of misunderstandings, how about that Potsdam Conference, summer of 1945?
The big three.
Trying to figure out what this post-war world's going to look like.
You'd think they'd be on the same page after defeating the Nazis.
You would, but what happened?
Shen argues it actually exposed how deeply divided they already were. I mean, particularly when it came to Europe, how to structure it, who controls what.
Yeah, the seeds division right there.
And it just kept getting worse. You've got the Marshall Plan in '48.
Intended to rebuild Europe, right?
Right. But Shen argues that Stalin saw it as the West trying to encroach on his sphere of influence.
Which, I mean, it kind of was, wasn't it?
From Stalin's perspective, absolutely. So instead of bringing Europe together, it ended up deepening the divide. Economically, ideologically.
Cementing those spheres of influence. So now we're starting to see those Cold War battle lines drawn.
Yeah.
But let's shift gear a bit, head east, because Shen makes this really interesting point about how closely tied the Chinese Civil War was to everything going on in the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely. When the communists won in '49, it completely shifted the balance of power in Asia.
No more kidding.
And you know what's fascinating? Shen talks about how Stalin wasn't even all that gung-ho about Mao's revolution at first.
Wait, seriously? I would have thought.
I know. But he actually saw a strong communist China as a potential rival, not just an ally. He even says, and this is a direct quote, Stalin viewed a powerful communist China as potentially more rival than ally.
Wow. Okay, so already we're challenging some assumptions here. But then you've got the Sino-Soviet Treaty in 1950, and that's when China officially joins the communist bloc.
Big moment. Changes the whole game board of global politics.
Which brings us to, well, Korea,
Oh, the Korean War. Yeah.
1950 to 53. And, we often think about it from an American perspective, but for China, this was happening right on their doorstep. Couldn't have been more real.
Yeah, and Shen argues that while the war was costly for China, it also allowed them to show their strength on the world stage. And, to actually negotiate with the USSR from a stronger position.
So they're fighting alongside the Soviets in Korea, but at the same time, they're realizing, hey, we need to assert ourselves here.
Exactly. It's not just communism versus capitalism for them. It's also about China's own ambitions, its own anxieties. It's about securing their place in this new world order.
Which I think is such a crucial point. We can't just look at the Cold War as this one big fight between two ideologies. It's way more complex than that.
Absolutely. And each country, each player had their own unique perspective, their own set of motivations. And the Korean War really highlights that.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of how crucial it is to consider different viewpoints when you're trying to understand something as complex as the Cold War. And I think that's something we're going to see play out again and again as we go deeper into Shen's analysis.
Oh, for sure. And trust me, it gets even more interesting from here. So we're diving back into Shen Zhihua's take on the Cold War. And last time, we saw how much Korea shook things up, especially for China. But it also kind of showed that this whole conflict, it wasn't staying put in Europe.
Things were going global.
Exactly. The Korean War was like the poster child for what they call proxy wars. The U.S. and the USSR backing different sides in conflicts all over the world.
It's like avoid direct confrontation, but still.
Oh, yeah. Still fight for global dominance.
It's like they were looking at a map and just picking spots, Where can we stir things up next?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, can you imagine living back then, knowing that any little fly-up could escalate? Like, things could go nuclear at any moment.
It's a lot.
It really is. And Shen makes this point, the Cold War, it wasn't cold for a lot of people, especially those caught in these proxy wars.
Yeah, it makes you think about all the individual stories, all the lives impacted. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the superpowers, the ideologies.
Right. But for millions, it was anything but cold. And it wasn't just about military force either.
Oh, right. There's that whole other level, the propaganda, the battle for hearts and minds.
Shen reminds us that a huge part of the Cold War was about cultural influence. Propaganda, sure, but also economic aid. Cultural exchanges even. Both sides trying to win people over to their way of thinking.
It's crazy to think about how, music, movies, even art, it all became part of this global struggle.
Yeah, you've got the U.S. doing their jazz diplomacy thing, sending musicians all over the place. The Soviets pushing socialist realism in their art and literature. It was a competition to see whose ideology looked the most appealing.
Like, hey, our system's better. Come and join us.
Exactly. It was playing out everywhere, from Hollywood all the way to, the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. It was this worldwide cultural tug-of-war.
So in all of this, where does China fit in? They're pretty new to the whole global power scene.
Right, they're trying to find their footing. And Shen argues that the Korean War, it was this real trial by fire for them. It forced them to look at those tough questions, their alliances, their place in the world, how to stay secure.
And how to manage that relationship with the Soviets, right?
Especially that. People might assume, oh, communist bloc, they must be best buddies.
Yeah, total solidarity.
But Shen points out that there were these tensions between China and the USSR from the very beginning, even with the treaty, even after fighting together in Korea.
What kind of tensions?
Oh, it was a mix of things. Ideological differences, for one. They didn't always agree on how to be communist. Plus, you've got those competing ambitions. They both want to be the leader of the communist world.
Oh, so there's some ego at play, too.
Definitely some big personalities involved. And remember how we talked about Stalin's hesitation to fully support Mao?
Yeah, he saw China as a potential rival.
Right. So even though they're on the same side in Korea, it kind of exposes those cracks in their relationship.
Right, because now China's proving itself on the world stage. They're not just taking orders from Moscow.
Exactly. And those cracks, they just kept getting bigger. By the 1960s, it's full-blown split, the Sino-Soviet split. Massive consequences for the whole global balance of power.
The communist bloc, it's not so unified anymore.
Right, it's like this big kaboom. Suddenly, the world's more multipolar. More players, more complexity. And for China, well, it's both good and bad news.
How so?
On one hand, they've got more freedom to do their own thing, but on the other hand, they're more isolated. The U.S. is putting on the pressure.
So they're playing this high-stakes game now, trying to keep the Soviets happy, manage the U.S. threat, and also pursue their own goals.
Right, it's a constant balancing act for them. And then, well, you know what happens in '72?
Nixon goes to China, the handshake heard around the world.
It's like this huge wait, what moment? because it showed that national interest, it can sometimes be more important than ideology, even in the middle of the Cold War.
The U.S. and China putting aside their differences because they both see the Soviet Union as the bigger threat.
Realpolitik in action. And that shift, that U.S.-China rapprochement, it just throws another wrench into the whole Cold War machine.
It's fascinating how these things can change so dramatically. The alliances, the rivalries, nothing's set in stone.
Exactly. And, amidst all this talk about strategy and power plays, we can't forget about the human cost.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about millions of lives affected by these Cold War conflicts, families torn apart, whole societies devastated.
Shen doesn't shy away from that. He brings in those individual stories, those human tragedies, reminds us that history is made by people. And these big ideological struggles, they have real consequences for ordinary people.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to always zoom back in, look at those individual experiences, because it's easy to get lost in the grand narratives.
Right, and to think that it's all just about abstract ideas, but it's not. It's about people's lives.
Absolutely. So as we move into the later stages of the Cold War, things start shifting yet again. The Soviet Union, they're facing all sorts of internal pressures.
And their grip on Eastern Europe, it's flipping.
Right. Gorbachev comes in mid-'80s with his perestroika and glasnost, trying to reform the system.
But those reforms...
They kind of backfire, don't they?
Yeah. Instead of fixing things, they actually helped bring the whole Soviet Union crashing down.
It's like all those cracks that are always there, they suddenly become huge fault lines, and by 91, it's over. The Soviet Union collapses. End of the Cold War.
Or is it... Because Shen's point is that the story doesn't really end there.
The legacy of the Cold War, it's complicated. And it's still shaping our world today, right?
Absolutely. So we've seen how it impacted China, how it reshaped global power. But now the question is, did it really end? Or did it just transform? Something to think about as we head into the last part of our deep dive.
All right, final stretch of our Cold War deep dive. I gotta say, I'm kind of blown away by all this. Seeing it from China's side really flips the script, you know?
It definitely challenges those traditional narratives we often hear.
No kidding. But, in all this talk about conflict and rivalry, it makes you wonder, did the Cold War actually create any opportunities for China?
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to focus on the negatives, the tensions, but for a country like China trying to find its place on the world stage, the Cold War also presented some unique advantages.
Okay, lay it on me. What kind of advantages?
Well, for one, it gave them a common enemy, the United States. Especially in those early decades, that shared threat with the Soviet Union was a powerful unifying force.
So that classic us against them mentality.
Exactly. And it was really important for the Chinese Communist Party. After years of civil war, the CCP needed to consolidate its power.
They needed to show the Chinese people that they were the ones to lead them into this new era.
Exactly. And having a common enemy, a powerful one like the U.S., it helped them do that. It legitimized their rule. It allowed them to crack down on dissent, implement those sometimes radical policies.
All in the name of national security, right?
Exactly. Shen really digs into that in his book. He argues that the Cold War created a context where the CCP could justify all sorts of things.
It's fascinating how a period of global conflict can actually create stability within a country.
It's paradoxical, isn't it? But it's important to remember this wasn't just some political game for China. The threat they felt, especially with the Korean War, right on their border, it was very real.
Absolutely. So aligning with the Soviet Union, at least initially, made sense for them.
Oh, strategically, it was crucial. It gave them that counterbalance to U.S. power. Plus, let's not forget the economic and military aid.
Right. The Soviets were pumping resources into China, weren't they?
Yeah, providing technical expertise, equipment, financial aid, things that were essential for China to start modernizing and industrializing.
So in a way, the Cold War helped kickstart China's development.
It definitely made a role. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, of course. There were major downsides to this alliance, too.
Yeah, you don't become a global power by always playing second fiddle.
Exactly. And Shen argues that China was constantly trying to balance this need for Soviet support with their desire for independence. They didn't want to become a puppet of Moscow.
So they're walking this tightrope, trying to play the game, but also forge their own path.
Right, and you can see how those underlying tensions, the ideological differences, the geopolitical ambitions, it was all brewing beneath the surface. And eventually, well, it explodes.
The Sino-Soviet split.
Yeah, 1960s. It shatters that whole image of a united communist world.
And it really underscores that idea that national interest, it often trumps ideology. Even when you're talking about communism versus capitalism.
Absolutely. The split created this whole new dynamic of the Cold War, a more multipolar world. And for China, it meant more freedom to maneuver, but also more isolation.
So they're trying to figure out this new landscape, and then, bam, Nixon visits China in '72.
Game changer.
Talk about a realignment of global power.
Right, suddenly the US and China are talking. They're finding common ground because they both see the Soviet Union as the bigger threat.
So, as we're wrapping up here, as we're looking back at all this through this Chinese lens, what are some of the big takeaways from Shen's work? What does he want us to understand about the Cold War and its legacy?
Well, one of the key points he makes is that power is never static. It's constantly shifting.
Yeah, we saw that play out in the Cold War, the rise of new powers like China, the decline of old ones like the Soviet Union.
And that same dynamic, it's still shaping the world today. Look at the emerging powers, the regional conflicts, the geopolitical maneuvering. It's a constant dance of power.
Makes you think about how those Cold War lessons are still relevant, even now.
Absolutely. Another big takeaway is the importance of perspective. The traditional Cold War narrative, the one we often hear in the West, it can be pretty one-sided.
It's like we're only seeing half the story.
Right. By exploring the Chinese perspective, by getting into their heads, we get this much richer, more complex understanding.
It forces us to challenge our own assumptions, see things from a different angle.
Exactly. And I think the final takeaway, the one that really sticks with me, is that the past isn't really past. The Cold War might be over, but its impact, its legacy, it's still very much alive.
It's shaping how countries interact, how they view each other, even how they view themselves.
Exactly. It's in our political systems, our economic structures, our cultural attitudes. And understanding those Cold War dynamics, those complexities, those legacies, it's crucial if we want to navigate the world today.
Well said. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe even challenged some of your own views. We encourage you to check out Shen Zhihua's book. It's a fascinating journey, and who knows, it might just change how you view the Cold War and its impact on our world. Until next time, keep exploring.